If the Bill of Rights were put to a vote, would it pass? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, Representative James Clyburn was being interviewed on MSNBC. Clyburn, the Democrat from South Carolina, and he wasn't really talking about the Bill of Rights. In fact, the whole episode or the segment was about the 1994 crime bill, which is tearing the Democratic presidential contenders apart as they try to attack former Vice President Joe Biden over it. In any case, at one point, when it was mentioned by the anchor that Elizabeth Warren would like to tear up the 1994 crime bill, Representative Clyburn goes off on kind of a tangent where he says that he is not in favor of just uprooting things, that we should improve things, and he thinks that if the Bill of Rights were to come to a vote today, he's not sure that it would pass. Before we go into any more detail on that, do you agree with Representative Clyburn?
I certainly feel the same kind of social trends that would make him make a statement like that. But I don't think, even at this level of insanity, that there'd be much question that it would indeed pass. It's awfully hard to argue with the Bill of Rights. And I find it particularly distressing to realize that the two amendments that would have the biggest problems would be the first and second. I could understand the second because of people's aversions to firearms, but watching people voluntarily censor themselves and calling for restrictions on speech, like the freely calling for restrictions on speech, that surpasseth all understanding.
Well, it's interesting because when I watched the clip, it was not clear to me whether he was saying this was something that because he said he talks to a lot of people. In fact, let me quote him. James Clyburn says, "I run into people every day who would like to see so much of those guarantees uprooted." And then he passingly mentioned the Second Amendment. It's not clear to me whether he's saying that it's people in his own party or people in the other party, but he specifically raised that issue of the Second Amendment, and he was using this to buttress an argument where he said we shouldn't just tear up the 1994 crime bill. It almost sounded like he was saying, let's hang on to those Second Amendment guarantees. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have no doubt he's a Democrat. That's what he wants to do. I have no doubt about it whatsoever.
Now you're going to have to explain that to me for a second, because I'm not sure I heard you right. So he is saying that he doesn't think we should tear things up, and he specifically mentioned that some people would like to tear up the Second Amendment. But it sounded to me like he was backing the Second Amendment.
I misunderstood. It does sound like he's backing the Second Amendment. I haven't heard the clip, so if he is backing the Second Amendment, that makes him a major outcast in the Democratic Party, is going to hurt his chances. If, on the other hand, just because I didn't read the clip, if he is on the other hand, see the clip, if on the other hand he is saying we don't need the Second Amendment, we'd be fine if it didn't pass, then he will be the darling of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and lose more of the middle, which is the rocks they find that ship upon.
So if you put to a vote today, let's take that Second Amendment, you put to a vote today and speculate on this and say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And do you think that this vote would be 51-49?
I'm going out on a limb wondering, just on a yes or no, I can't give you numbers. I was told there'd be no math during the show, but just even on a pass-fail basis, I think the Second Amendment would be the only one that really had a fight to get passed again. And of course, the beautiful thing about that is that since we have a Second Amendment, this entire discussion is purely rhetorical. It's absolutely theoretical question because we have a Second Amendment. So we can discuss whether or not the Second Amendment would pass, and the signs that it may not pass are a serious indication of major social ills in this country. But with that said, the only way to get rid of the Second Amendment is to amend it. There's no possible world where there's enough votes to do that. And since people are talking about getting rid of it, it's yet another example of how the Second Amendment is the one that guarantees the whole Constitution, not just the other amendments on the Bill of Rights.
Well, Prohibition was seen as a fleeting phenomenon that the country quickly turned its back on and then passed another amendment repealing the Prohibition Amendment, the ban on alcohol, essentially, beverage alcohol. Maybe we just went through a short period of time where people thought it was okay to have individual rights to carry guns.
That short period of time being all of human history?
Well, we're just dealing with the United States of America, so just a little over 200 years.
So our entire history, the 250 years there. Because prior to people carrying firearms, they carried swords and daggers, and prior to that, they carried sharp rocks and long sticks and stuff. So we may be in the waters where, for the first time in human history, we have made things so. In fact, I suspect this is true. We have made things so prosperous, so comfortable, so secure that we have absolutely lost as a culture. I'm talking about Western civilization, specifically progressive Western civilization. I suspect that we have gotten to the point where people like that genuinely believe that you don't need to be able to defend yourself or your country, that everybody out there is reasonable and rational, and you solve the whole thing if we would just get into a hot tub, smoke a couple joints, and have a bottle of Cabernet. Then what problem could not possibly be resolved that way? You have to have a certain amount of material affluence in order to be that stupid. And my concern is that because of the work done by the founders and because of the Second Amendment and all the Bill of Rights and all of the things that make America so successful, that success continues to produce so much in the way of prosperity, so much in the way of leisure time, and so much in the way of security that people have come to take things like self-defense and security as you phrased it here, as this kind of like this archaic thing that we've somehow outgrown. We haven't outgrown murder, and we haven't outgrown tyranny. And to the degree that people are calling for not only the abolishment of the Second Amendment, but the abolishment of the First Amendment, is telling me that these social justice warriors are not new people at all. They're not a different breed of people. They're the same kind of people that have always wanted to inflict their will upon other people. And for the first time in human history, and looking around the world today, I'm starting to believe the only time in human history, there was a government born on the earth that was wide enough to make sure that ultimate power resides with the people. And that's the thing that progressives hate about this amendment, because it is something that cannot be legislated away. It has to be taken away. And the problem with taking away guns from people with guns is that they have guns.
Bill, in the early days of this republic, and when this whole discussion came up about the original amendments to the Constitution, not specifically referred to as a Bill of Rights until sometime later, but there were many what we would call stalwart conservatives, constitutionalists, so to speak, at the time, who said, we should not specify individual rights like this, because if we do, then government is going to think that they have something to say about it. If you put, for example, gun rights into a document that is the framing of the federal government, then people in the federal government are going to think that that's within their purview. And certainly it seems to have played out this way, Bill. Couldn't you make an argument for maybe getting rid of the Bill of Rights so that the government would stop thinking that this is their business?
Yeah, that's right, Scott. If only we abolished the Constitution, the government would get smaller, more honest, and more responsive.
Not the whole Constitution, just the Bill of Rights part.
So look, I understand the argument, and there's a basis for the argument. It's an argument. You can make a case that it's a sound argument, but I don't think it's the correct side of the argument. And the reason I don't think it's the correct side of the argument is a very simple, almost daily experience that we have, at least watching TV. Certainly we don't have this experience personally every day, but it's familiar to us. When something happens, we have an interaction with authority. One of the first things people will say is, I know my rights. And you know your rights. If those rights weren't spelled out and enumerated, what would you say? Would you say, the Constitution forbids you from doing this? And he would say, where is it forbidden in the Constitution? You would say, well, it's just naturally. No. It's like I have a Fifth Amendment right. If somebody's saying, well, you're going to have to testify. No, I'm not.
But that's exactly the reverse view of the Constitution that even the framers of it had, Bill. They didn't say that just because something isn't mentioned in the Constitution, therefore it doesn't exist.
No, that's exactly right. And that's why there's the 10th Amendment. But my point is that people have, is that the argument that of saying that by defining rights, we're looking for trouble because anything we don't define is not considered a right anymore. That's got some weight on the pen. Or worse,
that the government thinks that because we defined a right related to guns, therefore control of guns is somehow in the hands of government. And even though they may not be able to ban the personal use of guns, it's certainly in their ballpark and they're allowed to do stuff with it.
Well, fortunately, the amendment was written in such a way that it is crystal clear, and that's not any way to interpret the amendment, and it's well known why the amendment was there, so that argument doesn't really hold water. But back to the business about not enumerating the rights. That is a very philosophical argument, and it is an argument that requires coolness and calmness and reflection. And it may be that in a society of Aristotle's that this may in fact be the case, but human beings don't operate that way. And I'm not talking about any particular class, race, or anything. All human beings react that way. When you ask me about how am I protected from my own government, I can list any number of things that are specific protections for me. And the thing about it, Scott, is that I still to this day, and you've studied it more than I have, but to this day, I still haven't found a flaw in the Constitution. I found many cases where people would deliberately misinterpret what it's saying, but if you take it for as it said, the Commerce Clause being a prime example of this, I cannot find a flaw in it. I really cannot.
Aren't you in effect saying that you haven't found a flaw in the way that you read the Constitution?
I read the Constitution the way everyone should read the Constitution. I read it in English. I can comprehend the English language. I know what these words mean. They went to enormous trouble to make sure that there were no terms specific to the Constitution. They went to enormous trouble to make sure that sometimes extremely complex ideas were reduced to their absolute core basics and written in a language that any single person can understand. So when I say I read the Constitution one way and somebody says they read it another way, then they are adding their perception to it because I am going by the basis of what the sentences in English actually say.
And nevertheless, long lines of not only judges, but politicians and general members of the populace have found that when they read the Constitution, they don't see it the Bill Whittle way. And so they would say that your Constitution is flawed, my brother.
Well, they'd be wrong. And I'd be willing, if they want to go to an argument about it, then I'd be willing to show that they're wrong. I'd be willing to show, for example, that commerce has no business being regulated by Congress because I would read the Commerce Clause. I'd read it out loud. And I would say, here's the language that's used continually throughout the entire Constitution. United States, the states, and the people. The United States federal government, the states and state governments, the people, the people. Congress shall have the right to regulate commerce among foreign powers, Indian tribes, and what is it? And among the states, from one state to another. And so anybody who wants to argue with that, if they really are talking about a rational argument, all of those rational arguments could be defeated. And it's not like I'm a magic guy, Scott. It's not like I just parachuted down and had all these answers. The reason that I think that the way I read the Constitution is the correct way, because millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people have read it the same way, and they understand the intent of the framers, and hundreds of millions of people can understand the English language. So if you want to say, well, that's your reading of it, that's kind of the same thing as saying, well, that's your truth. No, there is the truth. There may be a perspective on the truth that somebody else doesn't have, but there's not two opposing truths. There is a truth. And this foundational idea is also under attack, not just in America, but all throughout Western civilization, because we have become so unbelievably successful that we have nothing to do but to look at our navels and to imagine, that in it reside billions of galaxies or whatever the hell you do when you're navel gazing. But no, there's no two ways to read any of these things. There just isn't.
So let's say, final question here, Democratic
Sure.
National Convention of 2020, they get together to nominate their presidential nominee and vice presidential nominee. And you know how these conventions are. They also pass a bunch of other resolutions to make statements, and they have a platform committee and all that kind of stuff. Let's say it comes up for a vote at the 2020 Democratic National Committee meeting, and they basically say, we're going to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Does it pass or not, and why not?
I think
why?
As a one vote for
Yes.
the whole 10?
Yes.
It's disgraceful to say that I think there'd be some doubt about that. A lot of people would give up the First Amendment in order to get rid of the Second. These are people who don't understand much about how people work. But I have to tell you, given this crop of progressives, I would say that if you had to thumb up or thumb down the Bill of Rights at the Democratic National Convention, I think that one might be a fight. But if you were to do it out in America, it wouldn't be any fight at all. And just to close this interesting little idea that we've been talking about, I think the more interesting issue is not even a question, at least in my mind, as I understand things. The most interesting part of this whole thing is, let's say that there were votes to overturn the Second Amendment. Let's say that there were votes to overturn the Second Amendment and that it was done absolutely constitutionally. It was revoked exactly the same way as the Prohibition Amendment was revoked. As I understand what I read from the Constitution, you could have 435 congressmen voting for repeal. It could be ratified by 100 senators voting for repeal. It could be signed by a president voting for repeal. And you still can't repeal it because the Second Amendment doesn't give me anything. It simply says that the government cannot take this away from me. The right to self-defense is inherent in me as natural right. It's not dependent on legislators. So even if the entire constitutional mechanism were to work correctly, internally, you cannot remove rights from people because the rights don't come from the government. They come from God. They come from your creator. They come from whatever you want to believe in. They're naturally, it's a natural part of being a human being on a planet that appreciates the rule of law and understands human nature.
Well, a natural part of being a member at BillWhittle.com is your desire to see these conversations spread around the world. And these folks are the ones who make it happen. We're grateful for your membership dollars. We appreciate the way our members spread these videos. And if you are not yet one of them, why don't you join us today at BillWhittle.com? Click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.